welcome everybody to a Zoom event this evening. Those of you who are our members know that we're under a constraint about using the premises of the CSMVS. Please bear with us for a few more months and then we'll be back on campus. But in the meantime, on behalf of the chairman, the trustees, the director general, Mr. Sabyasachi Mukherjee, Nancy, a very, very warm welcome to you in our midst to address us. We are looking forward to your lecture. We haven't had a lecture on this topic, Nancy, since pre-COVID days. So it's very interesting that you'll be addressing us, as Jason said, on Adivasi artists and their philosophies of an expanded life. A much needed topic to be shared and looked at in these times when we are quite confused about where we are going and citizenship and things like that. But I know you're going to give us a feast, a visual feast. And I do hope you've included the little slide with the birds scurrying across the foreground. I'm sorry we couldn't put it into the invitation card, but I'm looking forward to seeing it. A few words, ladies and gentlemen, on what we're actually going to hear and Nancy's take on it. Beauty tends to be regarded with suspicion in a contemporary art world that prizes criticality. By contrast, artists of Adivasi origin cherish the possibility of making what is broken whole and endow their pictorial conceptions with beauty, despite leading lives constrained by social asymmetry and the systematic degradation of their ecologies. Nancy will engage with these artistic choices by reference to the cultural critique, Terry Eggleton's observation that, and I quote, capitalism plunders the sensuality of the body, unquote. For many Adivasi artists, Adajania argues criticality lies not in making pictures of the political, but in asserting their agency against extractive capitalism by reclaiming the sensorium to relay their ecological attuned philosophies of this expanded life. I'm not going to speak more on this topic. I'm going to let Nancy do that, but I would like to say something about Nancy because she has an amazing biodata and she comes with us with such a varied fund of experiences and projects that she has undertaken. As you all know, Nancy is a cultural theorist and a curator based in Mumbai. She was joint artistic director of the 9th Gwangju Biennale, South Korea, way back in 2012. She has curated a number of path-breaking exhibitions, including most recently, Woman is as Woman Does. And this was at the CSMVS Museum, our birthplace, along with JNAF, the Jangarh Nicholson Art Foundation. That was in 2022. It was the first ever intergenerational mapping of the works of Indian women artists, filmmakers, and activists against the backdrop of the women's movement in India. Nancy's other major research-based exhibitions include Navjot Altaf retrospective called The Earth's Heart Torn Out and Navjot Altaf, A Life in Art at the National Gallery of Modern Art in Mumbai. That was with Guild in 2018. And the Sudhir Patwardhan retrospective, Walking Through Soul City, SOUL, most interesting title, and that was in 2019. Nancy's key preoccupations is the retrieval of artistic positions that have been marginalized from canonical accounts of Indian art history. In this spirit, she has curated Countercanon, Alternative Histories of Indian Art. And that's on the prehistory of new media art in India. And this was showcased at Serendipity Arts Festival in Goa in 2019. And one of my favorites, Nancy, I'm being partial, The Unpaved Crusty Earthy Road, the retrospective of the textile artist and crafts activist, the late Nellie Setna. And this was for Simrosa at 50, which Nancy presented along with Mortimer Chatterjee at the Chatterjee and Lal Art Galleries. So I'm not going to stand and say anything more, except one of the most wonderful things she did, which really has been wonderful, is the Kochi Biennale Foundation invited her, and she conceptualized and led the online workshop called Once Upon a Cultural Famine, a curatorial thought experiment for the Kochi Biennale. So thank you so much, Nancy, for joining us. And I hand the screen over to you. Before I do that once more, I'd like to thank our young, talented team of technical assistants that join us for all our talks. Thank you, team, very, very much for your technical inputs, and to Dr. Prachi Jariwala, who will be giving us the vote of thanks at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Firoza, Anita, and Jason. It's been such a pleasure and an honor to return to the Museum Society. This is the second time I'll be speaking on this platform. The earlier lecture I gave was, of course, on the retrospective that I curated for the Simrosa at 50 celebrations. And Firoza, you were with me throughout the project, giving me encouragement and much love. So I have a lot to be grateful for. And with that, I'd like to begin with today's presentation, In Excess of Adivasi Artists and Their Philosophies of an Expanded Life. So first, I'll just provide a roadmap for the lecture so as to be able to make legible my central preoccupations. I'll be dividing this lecture into 3 parts. The first part, I would like to revisit in a memoiristic spirit my early years as a researcher and a programmer, curating workshops and symposiums where I experienced the sensorial, philosophical, and expressive richness of the life world to which India's subaltern practitioners belong. And I experienced this through story, song, dance, picture narration, utterance, performance, parable, and trance. In the second part of the lecture, I will be dwelling on specific artistic practices and how they embody a belief in abundance, beauty, and interspecies coexistence. What they relay are ecologically attuned philosophies of an expanded life. I will be focusing on the works of Durgabai Vyam, a practitioner of the Jangarh Kalam. I will also address the practice of Shantibai from the Dialogue Center in Bastar. In the third part, I would like to ask what happens to the sensorial and expressive richness of the life world of these artists? Is it fully articulated through the media and context to which they now have access? Specific histories of the modern have led them to operate in economies of making and circulation premised on the painting or the mural. How can they extend their formal and material possibilities beyond these parameters to convey the fullness of their fabular wisdom, their records of joys and anxieties in a present that is designed to exclude them? Clearly, a sheet of paper and a wall do not suffice. So if not, why not? And what can be done about it? My talk will conclude with some of these reflections. So back to the memoir. I met Tanaji Thitte in my office at the NCPA, the National Center for the Performing Arts in Bombay in 1995. It was my first job, and as I sat at my desk planning a national symposium on the crafts titled Should the Crafts Survive?, in he walked with an electrifying mane, his histrionic edge barely contained in his NCPA uniform. He had a garland of bulbs around his neck. Apparently, he had to replace a faulty wire in my room. The next time he came, he brought an album of photographs with him. In it, I found the picture of a man posing in a traditional 9-yard sari, his hair tied in a tight bun Staring at the photograph, I wondered who this end of the century Bal Gandharva could be. I sometimes go shopping with my wife dressed in a sari, laughed Tanaji. Soon after our meeting at NCPA, he invited me to an all-night Gondhal performance in the slums of Ghatkopar. Gondhal is hullabaloo in Marathi, but it also carries the connotations of chaos, confusion. As Tanaji performed the Murli's role, he crossed the borders of sexuality with ease and transformed himself into a woman at will. He enjoyed this role playing and was very proud of his ability to change gender, both in performance and seemingly in reality. Sadly, I don't have any photographs of Tanaji during the Gondhal performance, but an envelope fell out of my file the other day. He had left his nomadic tribe certificate and a photograph at the Moorcroft's office when I was working there. And I'm sharing that with you. My memories of him, of course, exceed the census certificate he wanted me to have. I remember the thunderous sound of the sambal that announced the Gondhal performance. The night shook like a coal-black backdrop. The fire torches blazed. Tanaji and his brother Shivaji danced like the wind and sang their full-throated invocations to awaken the goddess to purge the universe of all evil. A man slammed open the window of his milk booth. And just like that, it was morning. The performance ended abruptly in the middle of a song. Tanaji seemed to be hurt by the audience's need for entertainment overriding the devotional aspect of the performance. I returned home with Tanaji on the first train in the morning in the luggage compartment brimming with tokeries of fresh vegetables. He got off the train and disappeared into the crowd at VT station. He had to put in overtime at NCPA to earn some extra money. The theatre ushers and other workers at NCPA were curious about my interest in popular culture and subaltern art. They would turn up at my office to chat about folk paintings, dance drama forms, and animistic forms of enchantment that the forbidding Philip Johnson architecture, surrounded by manicured lawns and starchy hierarchies, would never have permitted. The NCPA worker who was in charge of ferrying the film cans of Manikal's Chitrakathi, which I showed during a workshop on this folk art form, was eager to discuss the presence of the hypnotic drone at the beginning of the film. This insistent sound had stirred up something in his imagination. A montage of sounds, visuals, and smells dissolve on my mind screen as I recollect my field trips in coastal Maharashtra and central India. My field work on Chitrakathi, picture narration scroll in Pinguli, Maharashtra, gave me the opportunity to meet the dynamic Chitrakathikar Ganpat Sakaram Maske, whose narration on alternative versions of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata was complemented by stylized paintings in the so-called done in the so-called Paithani style, handed down in his community for many generations. While television had begun to reduce our experience of the epics to a single authorized versions in the 1990s, coinciding with the rise of the Hindu right, Muske's folk versions remained polyphonic and open-ended, rupturing the boundaries between the classical and the folk, the ancient and the contemporary. His versions also reflected local preoccupations rather than the centralized ideological concerns of neo-Hinduism. Authority was stood on its head. The threshold personae of the epics, like the woodland demons, the artisans, were privileged, presented as subaltern heroes. For example, Muske narrated a Ramayana episode when Ram's mistrust of his virtuous wife Sita led him to order Lakshmana, his brother, to cut off her hands. At this moment in the narrative, the humble Chitaris, the local artists, artisans of Savantwadi, appeased Lakshmana with a pair of real-seeming but artificial hands, which they had labored to make. By importing the Chitaris and their profession, that of making lacquered wooden fruits and toys, into the epic, Musquet had inducted local and proletarian figures into the epic as active participants in the action. To me, this demonstrates very clearly the dynamic relationship between the Chitrakathi artist and the life world. Husserl's idea of the Lebenswelt, or the life world, is the horizon of values, assumptions, sustaining myths, and social practices within which consciousness unfolds in any society or milieu. The life world is not static or inert, but constantly shifting and changing. And its relationship with consciousness is also interactive. Consciousness can act upon the life world and is acted upon by it. What comes through in these multisensory, multimedia forms, whether that of Chitrakathi or the Gondhal performance, is the confident will to cosmicity, as I would phrase it. By the will to cosmicity, I mean the belief that through imaginative play in the space between the worldly and the sacred, one can simultaneously act in mythic time, but also intervene in one's political and ecological spheres. In the Gondhal performance, the artists paradoxically quell chaos with chaos. In the Chitrakathi episode, the Chitaris defy the will of the divine sovereign, befooling him with their consummate artistry. These narratives, with their subversive and participatory energies, robustly counter the cliche of Indic fatalism. They embody the could be, which is a desired social, political, ecological, or metaphysical imaginary. Later in my lecture, I will address the question of what happens when the continuity between the Lebenswelt and art gets ruptured or severed, and where this leaves the potential of the could be. I'll now segue into the second part of the lecture. Beauty tends to be regarded with suspicion in the contemporary art world that prizes criticality. By contrast, artists of Adivasi origin cherish the possibility of making what is broken whole and endowing their pictorial conceptions with beauty, despite leading lives constrained by social asymmetry and the systematic degradation of their ecologies. Let's see how this plays out in the works of Shantibai and the Vyams and the Shyams, Jangarh Singh Shyam and Nainkusia Shyam. I'd like to begin with the practice of the Bastar-based artist Shantibai, who is the co-founder of the Dialogue Center. Shantibai's maternal grandmother belonged to the Murya community, and her father was of Vishwakarma lineage. Historically, the line between caste society and Adivasi society has always been osmotic. There are many instances of Adivasi groups being absorbed into the caste system. Shantibai's painting unfolds like an evening raga. As if in a dream, 4 white birds with lapis lazuli eyes appear in the middle of the road. A woman in black pauses to photograph them. The birds, the woman, and the surrounding trees are connected by colored dots that swirl around these beings without differentiating amongst inquisitive beaks, a keen human eye, and trees that open out their branches before the witching hour. The photographer in this painting by Shantibai happens to be the Bombay-based artist Navjot, whom Shantibai often represents as holding a camera. Through their ongoing dialogue, the artists Shantibai, Rajkumar, and Gesturam in Bastar, along with Navjot, they have tried to negotiate in a critically alert spirit the situation of being an artist as ethnographer. So how do they deal with Navjot, a Metropolitan Academy trained artist who comes to Bastar to intervene in their lives by first initiating a collaborative project to see how the dialogue would go, and then slowly catalyzing the possibilities of building infrastructure of art and of care in Bastar. Now, in the painting, Shantibai portrays her collaborator, Navjot, of more than 2 decades with equanimity. Before we begin to speculate about the possible imbalance between these two artists in terms of their aesthetic and discursive capital, let me gesture towards Shantibai's fantastical white birds and what they might cunningly convey. Are they snowbirds, or are they winter migrants of the humankind who arrive in tropical Bastar every year to do their field work amongst the Adivasis, escaping the arthritic cold back home? A far more likely explanation is technical rather than conceptual. Shantibai may have felt impelled to play with negative space, to create an illusion of depth in an otherwise flat pictorial space. This effect of depth generates a corresponding sense of sculptural relief, which brings to mind many of Shantibai's sculptures. In the painting, the birds are huge, technically out of proportion to the rest of the pictorial space. Shantibai does not allow the proprieties of scale and perspective to affect her work. Unlike her collaborator Navjot, she was not schooled in a conservative academic art pedagogy that she had to unlearn. Her Adivasi worldview, one that enshrines an interspecies coexistence, is not fixated on the human being as a sovereign species trapped in a self-created quagmire of hierarchy and planetary destruction. For Shantibai, a bird could be as large as a human being, and a human being could be as small as a bird. She has gifted Navjot her dream of bird phantasms, just as Navjot had once infected her with the desire to initiate her own practice rather than remaining a lifelong assistant to her husband, the master craftsperson, Rethuram. When two dreams cross, both dreamers are transformed and renewed. Navjot's vision has been forever altered by her conversations with the artists who practice the ethics of interspecies hospitality. I say this knowing fully well that the environment of the Bastar artists has, meanwhile, been irreversibly transformed over the years by flawed developmental schemes and rapacious corporations working in collusion with the Indian state to poison their air, soil, and water through extensive mining. An observation that the literary critic Terry Eagleton once made speaks to this occasion. And I quote, "Capitalism plunders the sensuality of the body," close quote. These artists from Bastar have lived financially precarious lives, have been perceived as nothing more than labor, a derogatory term of extractive capitalism used by government officials and petty bourgeois traders for Adivasis and working class people. They know what it means to be robbed of agency, to be deprived of sensory pleasure. Art has saved them from absolute annihilation. Shantibai's works are suffused with a corporeal radiance. Her joy at being defined as an artist, rather than being dismissed as a thing of labor, is reflected in the dots of different chromatic temperatures that illuminate the picture surface. Projecting a dazzling, trembling light, these dots bolster the figure-ground relationship in her paintings. They forge bonds between the human and the more than human beings, the animate and the inanimate things that are depicted. The dots may run around trees heaving with star-shaped white kudai flowers found in Bastar's forests, like you can see on the screen right now. But they also circle around the mining trucks in Raigad that are driving away with the loot from the land. Shantibai's paintings are a stylized testimony to the everyday. In these works, she recalls her field trips around Chhattisgarh with her fellow artists, visits to mines, temples, a walk through the forest, a stroll around the river. Even when she deals with the pernicious subject of mining, her painting exhibits the heightened tenor of aesthetic delight. Is this a glaring contradiction? How do we reconcile her deadpan chronicling self? So she tells me, if you ask her, what initiated this work, truck mein koila le ja rahe. That's it. That's what she tells me. So how do we reconcile this deadpan chronicling self with her aesthetic sensibility, which is brimming with affect? Before our eyes are drawn to the truck, we are captivated by two prominent elements in the painting: a stately tree, bleached or moon silver, as the case may be, and a gorgeous indigo blue lake. Majestic as these are, we realize that they are utterly isolated in a landscape defined by what we first took to be a beaded recursive pattern formed by tantalizing dots. In fact, we recognize that this landscape has been over-inscribed by heavy earth-moving machinery. These are the tracks left behind by the wheels of trucks, the tooth marks of excavator buckets. Not an inch of the quarried, mechanized land remains immune to these markings. Only the tree and the lake, and who knows how long they will hold out. There's a generative tension between the beauty with which Shantibai invokes the horror visited upon her land and the horror itself. She deploys the language of the ornamental to portray the felicities of the everyday and also speak to the unfolding crises. By courageously exercising her will to make art, she returns the sensuality robbed by capitalism to the marginalized body and the wounded land. Thus, for Shantibai, criticality lies not in making pictures of the political, but in asserting her agency against extractive capitalism by reclaiming the sensorium to relay her ecologically attuned philosophy of an expanded life. I would now like to move on to the artist couple, Durgabai Vyam and Subhash Vyam. I had invited them for a workshop, which I had organized alongside my show, Woman is as Woman Does, which I curated last year at the CSMVS Museum in collaboration with the JNAF. Here's Durgabai at Woman is as Woman Does with her illustrations for Bhimayan, a graphic book on the visionary anti-caste leader, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, published by Navayan. Bhimayan, born of a dialogue with the publisher S. Anand, is punctuated with Durgabai and Subhash's experiments with the conventions of the graphic novel. For instance, the artists have replaced the boxed-in panels, which are very much the de rigueur of Western convention of graphic novels, with a corded and crenellated line based on the digna, which is an auspicious pattern with which they decorate their walls and floors. The digna line allows for a more fluid and organic form of storytelling that both contains, but also allows, that both contains and orders the narrative, but also allows for overflow and slippages. Artist of Pardhan Gond heritage, Durgabai practices the idiom pioneered by her relative, the legendary artist Jangarh Singh Shyam. She has expanded the Jangarh Kalam, or Jangarh style of painting, which is itself an invention by Jangarh, by investing it with her own subjectivity. May I request Jason to share the video with us?
अब ये भी बता रही थी दुर्गाबाई जी कि आप पेंटिंग में कभी भी कटा हुआ पेड़ नहीं यूज़ करते हैं।
पेंटिंग में जो है कभी कटे हुए पेड़ पे नहीं बनाऊँ कभी भी। और कटेहर पेड़ जो बनाए तो अशुभ होता है। तो इस तरह से मतलब शुभ शुभ में मैं पेंटिंग हमेशा मैं शुभ के नानी पेंटिंग बनाती हूँ कि आगे जाए कि अच्छा हरा भरा फूल अच्छा से रहे इसका। तो कटेहर पेड़ नहीं बनाऊँ मैं, जो एक खांगा कट जाती है तो थोड़ा अच्छा नहीं लगा और अशुभ होता है इसलिए।
I'll just share screen again. Yeah. Thank you, Jason, for sharing the video. Now, when Durgabai mentions that she does not show felled trees in her paintings because they are considered inauspicious, we should not leap to the conclusion that she's being superstitious. Like Shantibai, she's not making pictures of the political. Her work is a testimony to the ethics of interspecies hospitality, an ethic that unfolds through the invocation of abundance, of plenitude. But this abundance is not a nostalgia for what was, but what could be. It is her desired ecological imaginary. Since I did not want the students of the WIAWD workshop to be merely acquainted with a particular style of painting, I decided that it would be lovely if the students could get a glimpse into the life world of the artist through storytelling, song, utterance. And therefore, I requested Durgabai to narrate a story of her own choice. She came up with the story of the tiger and the boar, Sher or Suwar ki Kahani. A tiger and a boar were living in amity in the jungle. एक दिन सुअर के बच्चे हुए और बच्चे के भी बच्चे हो गए, शेर के बच्चे और सुअर के बच्चे खेलत रहे हैं. The tiger cubs and the piglets played together. When the tiger and the boar would go for lunch, the cubs and the piglets began to fight. The cubs threatened the piglets. We will eat you up. The piglets complained to the mother boar. They will throw us out of the jungle. The boar pacified the piglets and told them that everything will be okay. But the fighting resumed. The boar says, I'll take the kids and leave. If we keep fighting like this, it'll end our friendship with the tiger. Durgabai breaks into a song. Sherni कहती है, अपन दोस्त है, कहाँ जाबो? The boar laments, we will always remain friends. The boar leaves the forest to live in a village, and the tiger continues to live in the forest. This parable about the ideal of harmonious coexistence demonstrates an awareness of the forces ranged against it. The scenario demarcates the wild from the domesticated, habitation from expulsion. It carries the Adivasi's anguished knowledge of their gradual alienation from their own environment. It is intriguing that Jangarh Singh Shyam and his wife Nainkusia Shyam have painted this story from their own distinct perspectives. And I found another version of this very story in Jyotindra Jain's book on Jangarh, which is called A Conjurer's Archive, where he notes that Jangarh and Nainkusia love narrating this Sher and Suwar story, and they especially love narrating the moment of separation. And when they narrated this moment of separation, they sang together. When the tiger couldn't bear to see her friend the boar leave, she sings, Lohut lohut swara mitoli, larkan ke jagda mein kahe risoli. Come back, my friend, dear boar. Why are you so distressed because of our children's quarrels? In Jangarh's painted version of the story, which you see on the screen, and he has made quite a few versions, painted versions of the story. The tiger is shown in the dominant position, anxiously leaping out of the branches, wanting to cajole the boar who's resting under the tree. So we have an inkling of where the tiger stands in this picture in terms of a pictorial hierarchy and where the boar stands. But if you look at the painting more carefully, this top-down positioning of these two species or these friends, animal friends, is undercut by the shadows of the branches imprinted on their bodies. I would read this painting such that we experience a sense of, however briefly, these two bodies have been united through a play of light and shadow. Later, they will be wondering if they will ever see the same moon from their separate locations. But for now, they are blessed by light and its opposite. Now we move on to Jangarh Singh Shyam, Nainkusia Shyam's version, painted version of the Sher and Suar Ki Kahani. In Nainkusia's version, although the friends are seen to be locked in an embrace, something else seems to be transpiring here. The tiger is looking down in an angry sulk, while the boar's head is held high, looking away into the distance, knowing that separation is the fine print we fail to read in the contract of love. And I would love to talk more about these two different versions, three different versions, Durgabai's narration of the story, Jangarh and Nainkusia's very different ways of rendering these two animal friends and their moment of separation. Jangarh's work, for me, definitely he tells the story very definitely through a male gaze, while Nainkusia Shyam's version is a version which is marked by a strong female gaze. We could discuss what does it mean for the tiger to not be in a position of strength, as Jangarh shows him in his painting, versus the boar who has to leave the forest, who is expelled from the forest and who has to go and live in the village. The fact that she tries to create some form of temporary peace, the fact that she tries to keep the friendship between their two animal clans, she makes the effort towards peace. Although, of course, it is not easy. And although the boar and the tiger are locked in an embrace, you can already see that the boar is looking into the future, into a moment which is filled with love, but also filled with something which is less than love, something that is less than what could have been an interspecies coexistence. I now move on to the third part of my lecture, when viewers encounter Durgabai Vyam's paintings or Jangarh and Nainkusia Shyam's paintings in a museum or a gallery. However powerful the paintings are, the viewer's access is only through one sense. This is the version presented to sight. The experience does not include the world of song, story, utterance, and performance from which the painting emerges. All the elements which are in excess of the two-dimensional pictorial surface. Strange as this may sound, the problem lies with the choice of pictorial format. The emphasis on a singular moment in any narrative chosen for its dramatic portrayal, for its dramatic potential, or visual flamboyance. Jyotindra Jain calls this the monocynic narrative. Now, this format was an excellent choice for an artist like Jangarh, who was given paint and sheets of paper to work with without any prior painterly training. The monocynic commanded this given scale and allowed him to create a unique iconography. But every formal choice, I would argue, also involves limitations. In this case, it meant that Jangarh and the artists of the Jangarh Kalam were inducted into the economy of art making based on the two-dimensional surface at various scales, ranging from the work on paper to the mural project. The mural project allowed for more pictorial experimentation, and yet the excess remained unaccommodated within these artistic means. Had these artists had access to more hybrid media, such as the video installation or performance, one could speculate that they could have carried more aspects of their life world and its sensorium into their artistic production. The MP Tribal Museum in Bhopal recognizes this problem, but its proposed solution is flawed. The attempt at the MP Tribal Museum in Bhopal to create an immersive environment that reflects the life world of the artist rather than a white cube aesthetic leads to the generation of a proliferative excess. So what we see at the Tribal Museum is the proliferative excess of scenography and the overwhelming curatorial presence, which ends up exoticizing the artworks, framing them in a primitivist register. In conclusion, I come back to the question of how Adivasi artists could restore a dynamic interplay between their life world and their artistic practices. This could be achieved precisely by not seeing the life world as a sealed archive that must be translated through a particular vocabulary. It is true that Adivasi artists are extending themselves in creative directions today by collaborating with publishers and museum professionals. But their dominant expression remains the two-dimensional surface, which corresponds to certain market expectations. What does the future hold then? To achieve its full potential, perhaps Adivasi art will have to cease to be Adivasi art. And artists of Adivasi heritage could someday then become free agents at liberty to articulate their imaginaries, drawing on their past as well as the present, without having to play the designated roles that the market, the museum, and art history expect of them. Thank you so much.